The axe bit into frozen pine, and the sound rang out across empty ridges where no one was listening. Rowan Pike worked alone because that was how mountains taught a man to live, without witness, without mercy, without the soft lies people told themselves in valleys where winter was just a season and not a test. He had built everything here. The cabin. The cleared land. The stone walls that kept wind from tearing through his winters. 20 years of sweat pressed into soil that fought him for every crop, every fence post, every hour of peace. The land didn't care who claimed it on paper. It only answered to the man who bled into it. But the silence was starting to weigh. Not the silence of snow falling or wind moving through trees, that was just the mountain talking. It was the other kind. The kind that pressed into his chest at night when the fire burned low and there was no voice to break the dark. No reason to speak. No one would hear him if he did. Rowan wasn't a man who needed much. He didn't need comfort or conversation or the illusion that life owed him softness. But he was starting to understand that survival and living weren't the same thing. Survival was what he'd done for 2 decades. Living requires something else. Something he didn't have a name for yet. The idea came to him slowly, the way most hard truths did. He couldn't keep doing this alone. Not forever. Not if he wanted the land to mean something after he was gone. Not if he wanted the cabin to hold more than ghosts. So he wrote a letter. Plain words. No poetry. No promises he couldn't keep. He needed a household that functioned. Someone who understood that life up here wasn't gentle and wouldn't pretend otherwise. A partnership built on work, not feeling. The response came through a trader 2 months later. A widow named Mara Holt. She didn't ask for love or security beyond what labor could earn. She didn't write about dreams or hopes or the future. She wrote about capability. About resilience. About needing a place that wouldn't collapse under her if she leaned into it. Rowan read the letter 3 times. Then he wrote back. One word, come. It wasn't romance. It wasn't a rescue. It was 2 people agreeing that alone was harder than together, and that honesty was worth more than illusion. He didn't know what to expect. He told himself it didn't matter. She would arrive or she wouldn't. She would stay or she wouldn't. The land would still be here. The work would still need doing. He had survived worse than disappointment. But as the days shortened and the first frost crept down from the high peaks, Rowan found himself watching the trail more than he used to. Listening for sounds that weren't wind or animals. Preparing the cabin in small ways he didn't want to name, splitting extra wood, clearing space, fixing things that had been broken so long he'd stopped seeing them. He didn't let himself hope. Hope was dangerous up here. Hope made a man weak when winter came and nothing turned out the way he'd imagined. But he wondered. And wondering, he realized, was something he hadn't done in a very long time. The mountains held their secrets close. The snow would come soon, and with it, the long months when the world shrank to the size of a cabin and the people inside it. Rowan Pike had lived through 19 winters alone. The 20th, he thought, might be different. If she came. Mara Holt arrived on a clear October afternoon when the aspens had turned gold and the air tasted like coming snow. She came on horseback, leading a pack mule, her belongings tied down with the kind of knots that didn't come loose. No escort. No fanfare. Just a woman who knew how to travel and didn't need help doing it. Rowan watched her approach from the woodpile. He didn't wave. Didn't call out. Just set down his axe and waited, giving her time to see the land, the cabin, the life she was agreeing to. No surprises. No false advertising. She dismounted without hesitation, her movements efficient and sure. She was older than he'd expected, closer to 40 than 30, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that took in everything without judgment. She didn't smile. Didn't try to soften the moment with pleasantries that would ring hollow. Rowan Pike, she said. Not a question. Mara Holt, he answered. She nodded once, then turned her attention to the cabin, the cleared land, the woodshed, the small barn. Her gaze was practical, measuring. She was cataloging what worked and what didn't, what would need fixing before winter locked them in. "Where do you keep the tools?" she asked. Not where would she sleep. Not what the rules were. Not what he expected from her. Just the question that mattered most, where were the things that would let her work? Rowan showed her. The shed. The barn. The root cellar. The spring where water ran clean year-round. He spoke only when necessary, giving her information without decoration. She listened without interrupting, nodding at details that mattered, ignoring ones that didn't. When the tour ended, she unpacked her mule with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown in everything else. Rowan helped without asking, and she accepted without thanking. It wasn't cold. It was understanding. They were both past the age where gestures needed acknowledgement. That first night, they ate in near silence. Rowan had prepared venison stew, nothing fancy, but honest food that would keep them warm. Mara ate without complaint, then cleaned the dishes without being asked. She moved through the cabin like she was learning its rhythms, testing where things belonged, finding her place in the space. When she finally spoke, it was direct. "I'll take the loft for now. Until we know this works." Rowan nodded. He'd expected nothing else. Marriage on paper didn't mean sharing a bed. It meant sharing a life, and that took longer to build than any ceremony could create. The days that followed set their pattern. Rowan rose before dawn, and Mara rose with him. He worked the land, and she worked beside him, not following, not asking permission, just doing what needed doing. She learned quickly where things were, how the routines flowed, what tasks required two people instead of one. She was strong without needing to prove it. Capable without needing praise. She split wood with clean strikes, mended fences with steady hands, harvested the last of the garden before frost could take it. She didn't talk much, but neither did he. The mountain didn't require conversation. It required presence. In the evenings, they sat by the fire. Sometimes Rowan carved or mended harnesses. Sometimes Mara sewed or wrote letters to people he didn't ask about. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was just space, room for two people to exist without performance, without pretense. Respect grew in those quiet hours. Not affection yet. Not trust in the deep sense. But respect, the acknowledgement that each was holding up their end, that neither was taking more than they gave. It was enough. For now, it was enough. Winter arrived the way it always did in the high country, without warning, without mercy. One morning the world was autumn gold and the next it was buried under 2 feet of snow that wouldn't melt until spring. The mountain closed around them like a fist, and the cabin became the only world that mattered. Rowan had prepared for this. He always did. The woodshed was stacked full. The root cellar held enough provisions to last until thaw. The animals were sheltered and fed. Everything was ready. Everything except the part where another person shared his winter. He'd forgotten what that was like. The sound of someone else breathing in the dark. The shift in routine when meals were shared instead of eaten standing up over a cold stove. The way space felt different when it held 2 lives instead of 1. Mara adapted without complaint. She rose when he did, worked when he worked, and never asked for more warmth or more comfort than the cabin could provide. She understood what winter meant up here, endurance, not ease. She carried her weight without resentment, and Rowan found himself grateful for that in ways he hadn't expected. But gratitude wasn't the same as closeness. They still moved around each other like strangers sharing a camp. Polite. Careful. Keeping distance even when the cabin walls pressed them together. The cold bit deeper as December wore on. Rowan worked outside when he could, checking snares, splitting wood, breaking ice on the water trough. The work was harder in winter, but he'd never minded that. Hard work kept a man warm. Kept his mind from wandering into places it shouldn't go. It was mid-January when the axe betrayed him. The oak was frozen solid, harder than iron, and when his blade glanced off the grain it caught his left hand instead. The cut was deep, straight across the palm, opening skin and muscle in a line that bled fast and wouldn't stop. Rowan swore once, sharp and low, then pressed his other hand over the wound and walked back to the cabin. Blood soaked through his fingers, dark against the snow. Mara saw him coming. She didn't gasp or panic. She just moved, clearing the table, boiling water, pulling out the medicine kit he kept for emergencies. Her hands were steady as she cleaned the wound, her face calm even when she saw how deep it went. "This needs stitching," she said. Rowan nodded. He'd known that the moment it happened. She worked without hesitation, threading the needle, pulling the skin closed with careful precision. It hurt worse than the cut itself, but Rowan didn't make a sound. He watched her face instead, the concentration, the steadiness, the complete absence of fear. When she finished, she wrapped his hand in clean cloth and met his eyes. "No heavy work for a week. Maybe 2. "Can't afford 2 weeks, he said. "Can't afford losing the hand either," she answered. "I'll handle what needs to be handled. You rest." Rowan wanted to argue. Resting felt like weakness, like failure. But the pain was already spreading up his arm, and he knew infection was the real enemy now. Pride wouldn't keep him alive. So he nodded. The next 3 days blurred together in fever and aching cold. The wound turned red, then angry, then hot to the touch. Mara forced him to drink water mixed with herbs he didn't recognize. She changed the bandages twice a day, cleaned the wound with something that burned like fire, and wouldn't let him move from the bed except when necessary. She didn't fuss. Didn't coddle. She just did what needed doing with the same quiet competence she brought to everything else. And somewhere in the haze of fever and forced stillness, Rowan realized he wasn't alone anymore. Not just in the cabin. In the struggle. In the weight of surviving another winter. He wasn't alone. The fever broke on the 4th night. Rowan woke to darkness and the sound of wind howling against the cabin walls. His hand throbbed, but the fire in his blood had cooled. His mind was clear again. Mara sat by the fire, mending one of his shirts by lamplight. She didn't notice him watching at first. Her needle moved with patient rhythm, pulling thread through worn fabric, making something broken whole again. "You're awake," she said without looking up. "How long?" His voice came out rough. "For days since the cut. 3 since the fever started." She tied off the thread and set the shirt aside. "You're lucky. I've seen infections like that take a man's hand. Or worse." Rowan pushed himself up slowly, testing his strength. His body felt hollow, wrung out. The animals. Fed, watered. The snares are checked. Wood split. She poured water from the kettle into a cup and brought it to him. "I told you I'd handle it." He took the cup, studying her face in the firelight. She looked tired. More tired than he'd seen her. Dark circles under her eyes. Hair loose instead of tied back. She'd been carrying everything alone while he'd been useless. "You should have woken me," he said. "For what?" "So you could make it worse." She sat down across from him, her voice matter-of-fact. "You needed rest. I needed you not to die. Simple mathematics." Rowan drank the water slowly. It was the longest conversation they'd had since she'd arrived. The most direct she'd been. Something had shifted while he'd been lost in fever. "Why?" he asked finally. She looked at him, waiting. "Why stay up all night? Why push yourself like that?" The agreement was practical. "You didn't sign up for nursing." Mara was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled. Wind rattled the shutters. Then she spoke, her voice low but steady. "I had a husband before. Good man. Strong. Believed he could do everything alone." She stared into the flames. "Caught pneumonia one winter, wouldn't rest. Wouldn't admit he needed help. Keep working until his body gives out." Her jaw tightened. "Buried him in spring when the ground thawed enough to dig." Rowan said nothing. There was nothing to say. "I didn't come up here to watch another man kill himself with pride," she continued. "The agreement was practical, yes. But practical means keeping each other alive. That's the deal. That's what makes it worth anything." She met his eyes then, and he saw something in her gaze he hadn't seen before, not just competence or strength, but something deeper. Determination born from loss. The kind of resolve that came from failing once and refusing to fail again. "I'm not your guest, Rowan. I'm your wife. That means when you're down, I stand. When you can't work, I work. That's not charity. That's the arrangement. That's what we agreed to, even if neither of us said it out loud." The words settled between them like stones dropping into still water. Rowan felt something crack open in his chest, some wall he'd built so long ago he'd forgotten it was there. "I'm not good at this," he said quietly. "At what?" "Needing someone." Mara almost smiled. "Almost. Neither am I. But here we are." The fire burned lower. The wind eased. Outside, the mountain held them in its grip, indifferent to human struggle, unconcerned with human connection. But inside the cabin, something had changed. Rowan looked down at his bandaged hand. At the careful wrapping, the clean cloth, the evidence of care he hadn't asked for but had received anyway. "Thank you," he said. Mara nodded once. "You're welcome." It wasn't much. Just 2 words in a quiet room. But it was the first crack in the ice between them. The first acknowledgement that what they were building might become more than just survival. It was the beginning. Spring came slowly to the high country, reluctant and uncertain. Snow retreated up the mountains 1 inch at a time. Ice broke on the stream with sounds like gunfire. The world opened again, muddy and raw and alive. Rowan's hand healed. The scar ran across his palm like a white ridge, a permanent reminder of frozen oak and winter's teeth. He worked carefully at first, rebuilding strength, relearning grip. Mara watched without comment, but he felt her attention, making sure he didn't push too hard, didn't undo what had mended. They fell into new rhythms. The distance that had marked their first months together had shortened. Not gone, neither of them was built for easy intimacy, but reduced to something more comfortable. They spoke more often now. Small observations about weather or work. Occasional stories from the past, offered without pressure, received without judgment. Mara told him about her first husband's farm in the valley. The good years and the lean ones. The children they'd hoped for but never had. The slow accumulation of disappointments that looked like contentment until you examined them too closely. Rowan told her about his years alone. The fights that had driven him into the mountains. The people he'd left behind. The slow realization that isolation was both punishment and refuge, and he'd never been sure which he deserved more. The conversations happened mostly at night, after the work was done and the fire burned low. They didn't force it. Didn't schedule it. Just let the words come when they were ready, and listened when they did. It was late April when Rowan saw the riders coming up the trail. 3 men on horseback, moving slowly, deliberately. Not hunters. Not trappers. Something else. Rowan watched them from the woodpile, his gut tightening with instinct he'd learned to trust. They wore clean clothes. Carried saddlebags that bulged with paper instead of supplies. One had a leather case strapped across his back. Official men. Valley men. The kind who brought trouble wrapped in law. Mara stepped out of the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. She saw them too. Saw Rowan's posture shift into something guarded and tense. "Expecting anyone?" she asked quietly. "No." The men reached the clearing and dismounted. The one in front was middle-aged, soft around the middle, with the kind of face that smiled easily and meant nothing by it. He pulled papers from his saddlebag and approached with careful friendliness. "Rowan Pike?" he asked. "That's right. Name's Henderson. County surveyor." He gestured to the other two men. "This is Mr. Barnes from the territorial office, and Mr. Calloway, land assessor. We're here on official business. Nothing to worry about." Rowan said nothing. In his experience, when men said there was nothing to worry about, worry was exactly what you should do. Henderson unfolded the papers, smoothing them against his leg. "There's been a territorial development initiative approved. New road coming through from the valley to the mining camps up north. Good for commerce. Good for everybody. What's that got to do with me?" Henderson's smile thinned slightly. "Well, Mr. Pike, the survey route passes through this section. Your cabin sits right in the pathway. Now, we're authorized to offer compensation, fair compensation, for relocation. You'll have 60 days to clear out before construction begins." The words landed like stones. Rowan felt the mountain tilt beneath him, felt 20 years of work dissolve into nothing. "This is my land," he said, his voice flat. "Actually," Barnes stepped forward, pulling out another document, "that's where it gets complicated. Your improvements are noted, but there's no registered deed in your name. The land technically remains territorial property." Which means you can take it," Rowan finished. Henderson spread his hands apologetically. "We're not taking anything, Mr. Pike. We're offering compensation. This is progress. It's coming whether we like it or not." Rowan looked at the papers. At the seals and stamps and signatures. At 20 years being erased by ink. The men left their papers and rode back down the trail, leaving Rowan standing in the clearing with documents that felt heavier than stone. 60 days. 2 months to abandon everything he'd built, everything he'd bled into this ground. He stood there long after they'd gone, staring at nothing, his mind already making the calculations it had always made. Where he could go. How much he could carry. Which valleys still had unclaimed land far enough from civilization that this wouldn't happen again. Retreat. Disappear. Start over. It was what he'd always done when the world pressed too close. "Rowan." Mara's voice pulled him back. She stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching him with that steady gaze that missed nothing. "We should pack light," he said. "Head north before the weather turns. There's land past the high past that." "No." The word stopped him cold. "No," he repeated. Mara walked down from the porch, each step deliberate. "You're not running. We're not running. This isn't running. It's being practical. You saw those papers. They've got the law behind them. Got seals and signatures and got surveyors who've never set foot on this land before today," Mara interrupted. "Got maps drawn by men sitting in offices 100 miles away. Got assumptions that might not hold if someone actually challenges them." Rowan shook his head. "You don't fight the territory. You don't win against stamped papers. Maybe you don't. Alone." She moved closer, her voice firm. "But you're not alone anymore. That's what you seem to keep forgetting. Mara. I'm your wife, Rowan. Not a visitor. Not a hired hand. Your wife. That means this land is mine too. And I don't give up what's mine just because someone shows up with papers and a polite smile." He wanted to argue. Wanted to explain that hope was dangerous, that fighting authority only brought more trouble, that survival meant knowing when to fold and move on. But the words died in his throat because he was looking at her face and seeing something he recognized, the same stubbornness that had kept him alive for 20 years, reflected back at him like a mirror. Even if we fight, we'll lose, he said quietly. Maybe. But we'll lose standing, not running. There's a difference. Rowan looked down at the papers in his hand. At the neat handwriting and official stamps. At the thing that was supposed to end him. I don't know how to fight this, he admitted. Then we figure it out. Together. Mara reached out and took the papers from him, studying them with the same careful attention she brought to everything. They said no registered deed. That means they think you're a squatter. Are you? I cleared this land. Built everything on it. Been here 20 years. That's not what I asked. Did you ever file papers? Talk to a land agent? Get any kind of documentation? Rowan thought back. There was a trader. A long time ago. He helped me register a claim. Said it would hold as long as I improved the land. You have a copy? Maybe. Somewhere. Mara nodded, her mind already working. Then we start there. We found that paper. We find anyone who can testify you've been here working this land. We prove the survey is wrong, or incomplete, or that they missed something. She looked up at him. You know this land better than any man with a compass and a map. Use that. Rowan felt something stir in his chest. Not hope, he still didn't trust hope. But something else. Something that felt like possibility. You really think we can do this? He asked. I think we can try. And trying is better than disappearing into the mountains like a ghost. She handed the papers back to him. You've spent 20 years surviving alone, Rowan. Maybe it's time to see what we can do together. He looked at her, this woman who'd arrived as a stranger and stayed through winter and fever and now this. Who refused to let him retreat into the old patterns that had kept him safe and solitary. All right, he said. We fight. They started at dawn the next morning. Rowan tore through the cabin's storage, trunks and boxes he hadn't opened in years. Old papers yellowed with age. Letters from traders. Receipts for supplies hauled up the mountain. And finally, buried beneath everything else, the claim registration. Faded ink on brittle paper, but still legible. Still legal. Mara read it twice, her finger tracing each line. This says your claim extends 300 yards in every direction from the cabin. If their survey contradicts that, they're wrong. Or my paper means nothing after 20 years, Rowan said. Then we make sure it means something. They rode down to the valley together, something Rowan hadn't done in years. The territorial office was a low building that smelled of ink and stale air. The clerk behind the desk looked up with disinterest until Mara placed the claim registration in front of him. We need this verified against the current survey for the Northern Road project, she said, her voice calm and immovable. The clerk barely glanced at it. Surveys already approved, ma'am. Filed and sealed. Then unseal it. We have a prior claim that needs reconciliation. That's not how. That's exactly how it works, Mara interrupted. Unless territorial law has changed in ways I'm not aware of. In which case, I'd like to speak to whoever makes those decisions. The clerk blinked. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a woman who spoke like she'd read the law herself. He excused himself, disappeared into a back office, and returned 10 minutes later with someone higher up the chain. The process repeated. Papers were compared. Dates were checked. Discrepancies were noted. The survey, it turned out, had used old markers that had shifted over time. Boundaries had been drawn by men who'd never walked the land, working from maps that were approximations at best. But that wasn't enough. They needed more than technical errors. They needed proof. Rowan spent the next 2 weeks guiding the assessors back up the mountain, showing them every marker, every boundary stone, every improvement he'd made. He walked them through terrain their maps couldn't capture, showing where ridgelines ran, where watersheds divided, where their survey lines crossed land that couldn't support a road without catastrophic erosion. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried the weight of 2 decades living on that ground. He wasn't arguing. He was teaching. Showing them what they'd missed because they'd never bothered to look. Mara worked from a different angle. She rode to trading posts and trapper camps, collecting statements from men who'd known Rowan for years. Men who could testify to his presence, his work, his claim. She wrote letters to territorial representatives, polite but firm, asking questions that couldn't be easily dismissed. She was relentless. Not loud, not aggressive, but persistent in a way that wore down opposition through sheer steady pressure. Where Rowan would have withdrawn, she pressed forward. Where he would have accepted defeat, she found another angle. The work exhausted them both. Days in the saddle, nights reviewing papers by lamplight, meals eaten cold because there was no time to cook properly. Rowan's hand ached from the constant work. Mara's voice grew hoarse from talking, explaining, insisting. But slowly, cracks appeared in the territory's position. The survey had errors, multiple errors. The claim registration was valid and had never been properly superseded. The road route, when examined closely, could be shifted a quarter-mile east with minimal additional cost and no disruption to established homesteads. Henderson came back up the mountain in late May, alone this time. He looked tired. Less certain than he had before. Mr. Pike. Mrs. Pike. He nodded to each of them. The territorial office has reviewed the documentation. There are complications with the current survey. Rowan waited. Beside him, Mara stood silent, patient. The road project will proceed, Henderson continued. But the route is being adjusted. Your property will not be affected. He handed Rowan a new set of papers. Official withdrawal of the claim. Recognition of the original homestead boundaries. An apology buried in legal language. Then he rode away. The papers sat on the table for 3 days before Rowan finally put them away. He kept pulling them out, reading them again, as if the words might change or disappear. As if victory could be taken back as easily as it had been threatened. But the words stayed the same. The land was his. Theirs. Life returned to its rhythms, but everything felt different now. The cabin was still the same structure, rough-hewn logs, a stone fireplace, windows that rattled in the wind. But it no longer felt like a fortress against the world. It felt like something else. Something Rowan didn't have a name for yet. Home, maybe. Though that word felt too simple for what had changed. He watched Mara working in the garden one morning, her hands dark with soil, her movements efficient and sure. She'd been right about everything. About staying. About fighting. About what they could do together that he never could have done alone. For 20 years, he believed that strength meant independence. That needing nothing from anyone was the only way to survive in a world that took everything it could. He'd built his life around that belief, carved it into stone and snow, made it as solid as the mountains themselves. But he'd been wrong. Real strength wasn't isolation. It was knowing when to accept help. When to stand with someone instead of alone. When to risk connection despite everything that could be lost. Mara had shown him that. Not through words or arguments, but through simple presence. Though staying when leaving would have been easier. Through fighting when surrender would have been safer. She looked up and caught him watching. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," Rowan said. "Just thinking." "About?" He hesitated, then decided honesty was worth the discomfort. "About how I would have left. If you hadn't been here. Would have packed up and disappeared, would have lost everything because I was too stubborn to believe anything else was possible." Mara brushed dirt from her hands and walked over to him. "But I was here. And you didn't leave." "No," he agreed. "We didn't." The word felt significant. "We. Not me. Not anymore." She studied his face for a moment, then smiled, small and genuine, the kind of expression he'd rarely seen from her. "You're learning. Slowly. That's all right. We've got time." They did. The summer stretched ahead of them, warm and full of work. The garden would need tending. The fence line needed repair. Wood had to be cut and stacked for the next winter. The same endless cycle of labor that had defined Rowan's life for 2 decades. But it felt different now. Lighter, somehow, even though the work was the same. That evening, they sat on the porch as the sun dropped behind the western peaks. The valley below was turning gold in the slanted light. Somewhere down there, men were drawing new maps, planning new roads, making decisions that would shape the territory's future. But up here, the mountain held them in its ancient grip, indifferent and eternal. The land they'd fought for. The land that was theirs not because papers said so, but because they'd bled into it, worked it, refused to abandon it when abandoning would have been easier. Rowan looked over at Mara. She sat with her eyes closed, her face turned toward the last light, peaceful in a way he'd never seen her before. "Thank you," he said quietly. She opened her eyes. "For what?" "For staying. For fighting. For not letting me disappear." Mara reached over and took his scarred hand in hers. Her grip was warm and strong and steady, everything she'd been since the day she arrived. "That's what marriage is," she said. "Not the paper. Not the ceremony. Just 2 people deciding that together is worth more than alone." Rowan squeezed her hand gently. "Yeah," he said. "I'm starting to understand that." The sun set. The stars emerged. The mountain breathed around them, ancient and patient. And in the quiet darkness, Rowan Pike, who had spent 20 years surviving alone, finally understood what it meant to live. Not just exist. Not just endure. To live. With someone who saw him, stayed with him, and chose to build something that would outlast them both. The silence remained. But it was no longer empty. It was full. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the Wild West. Share this with someone who believes in second chances and the quiet strength of true partnership. Drop a comment below, what moment resonated with you most? Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.